Hey there, everybody. It's me, Audio Bible Lady, and I am so excited that we are starting a new book today. We are beginning the book of Exodus. So far, for a recap, if you are just coming in now to our study and our walk through the Word, we have started at Genesis chapter 1, and we learned about the creation and about the animals arriving, and then God making man in his own image. And then Eve coming out of a rib from man. And then we learned how by chapter 3, it didn't take long it seemed, huh? By chapter 3, we see this serpent. And I don't know, I like to glean him as the serpent, meaning Satan. That's what I get because when I read in Revelation and in Corinthians and in a few other places where Satan's referred to as a serpent, and also in other spots where I see him referred to as the great deceiver or the father of lies. Those are kind of hints throughout God's word that would suggest to me that that is who is speaking to Eve. But even that early on, he's using the words of God in a twisted form to deceive Eve, and Eve goes along with it. I know there's times in my life that I'll hear something and maybe it's a word that somebody else is saying and it's twisted just a tiny touch, so there's so much truth to it, like 90% truth, and then this little 10% that just throws the whole thing off. So even today we can glean from that lesson to use caution in what we're learning, and does it match up, does it line up with what God actually said in his word. Then we went into their children, and Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, and his blood cries out from the ground, so the Lord holds him accountable there. And then we see in an act of almost redemption, so to speak, for Adam and Eve, they're given Seth. And then we follow through into Abraham and Sarah waiting for a child and becoming impatient and trying to do it their own way. So they go through Hagar and produce Ishmael, but that's not who God had in mind. So sure enough, in their ripe old age, they give birth to Isaac, and this is who God intended. Now, that didn't come lightly. It came also with a great test, in a sense, from God, as he asks Abraham, will you do as I tell you, and will you sacrifice this child? And they get all the way up there, and it's like this climactic point in the story, and you're like, oh no, what's happening here? I don't understand. And then it all becomes very clear as we see a ram come from the thicket, and the angel's voice comes down and says, no, stop, don't kill him. We can see that you are faithful, that you trust the Lord, and that you will follow him and obey him. And then, we get into... Oh, I missed the 2x2 in the Noah's Ark, huh? Amazing story there of God's grace and mercy as the world had gotten really wicked, and he didn't snuff it all out. He didn't start from scratch and say, do over. He saw somebody that had favor in his eyes, and he went from there and made a way. Then we hear the story of Jacob and Esau and the birthright issues and the deception there, and then deception begat deception because Jacob deceived with Esau. So when it came time for him to go out and find his wives, Laban deceives him and says, oh yeah, I'll work 7 years for me, and I'll give you my daughter Rachel, who you are so fond of. And instead he gives her Leah. And Leah, he's not so fond of. In fact, he has no eyes for her whatsoever. And then later, for another 7 years, and he gets Rachel and so forth. And then we run into the story of Joseph, and that was kind of where we wrapped up. Joseph is an amazing story. It's one of my favorites in the Old Testament. Just God's grace and how he has his hand on everything, even when it doesn't look like it. So we saw in the story of Joseph how his dad loved him, his brothers hated him. They tried to get rid of him, and in the process of that, they were just doing the Lord's work for him and setting him up to the place where he needed to be for a time to come. And then we see the grace shown I mean, yeah, Joseph played with his brothers a bit when they came back, but ultimately showing that grace to them and saying what you meant for harm, God meant for good. So God had put him in that place so that when the famine came and when the hardships came, he was in a place of authority that he could help his family. And I think that's beautiful. So now we are going to kick off and start the book of Exodus. Chapter 1. The Israelites in Egypt. These are the names of the son of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph or what he'd done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks, and do all the work of the field. They were ruthless in all their demands. Then the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives: "When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live." But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" they demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time." So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. When Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, "Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live." What a horrible order to give. That wraps up Exodus chapter 1 and our recap of Genesis. I look forward to joining you guys next in video form to talk about a guy named Moses. See you then.